There is a place at the edge of the known world where the ice once reached down from the sky and touched the earth and held it for a very long time. When the ice finally let go, and it did let go, slowly, over thousands of years, retreating north the way a tide retreats from a shore, it left behind something extraordinary. It left behind a country, the largest country in the Western Hemisphere, a land of boreal forests that stretch farther than the eye can comprehend, of rivers that run cold and clear from mountains that were already old when the first human beings arrived to look at them. It left behind Canada, and the people came. They had been waiting, some of them, on the edge of a world buried under 2 kilometers of glacial ice, in refugia, small pockets of livable land where the cold had not quite reached. Others had crossed the land bridge from Asia, moving south and east through a corridor that opened between 2 great ice sheets as the glaciers began to retreat. They were not a single people. They were many peoples, speaking many languages, carrying many ways of understanding the world. They came and they settled, and they built lives in a landscape that was still, in many ways, finding itself after the long freeze. For thousands of years, the evidence of these people is continuous. We find their hearths. We find the bones of the animals they ate. We find the tools they made, shaped from stone with a patience and a precision that is genuinely beautiful when you hold the artifacts and study them. We find middens, the kitchen refuse of ancient households, that tell us what season they lived through, what they caught in the river, how many people sat around the fire. And then, approximately 5,000 years ago, something happens. The evidence stops. Not everywhere, not all at once, but across enormous stretches of what is now Canada, from the Maritimes to the interior plains, from the shores of ancient lakes to the edges of the boreal forest, the archaeological record goes quiet. The hearths go cold. The middens stop accumulating. The tools disappear from the sediment layers. For a period that in some regions spans 500 years, and in others stretches closer to 2,000, there is an absence where there should be presence. Historians and archaeologists call this the gap. They do not agree on what caused it. They do not agree on how wide it was, or how deep, or whether the people who vanished were truly gone or simply went somewhere the archaeological record cannot follow. What they agree on is this: something happened to the people of ancient Canada approximately 5,000 years ago, and we do not know what it was. That is what this documentary is about, not the answer, because there isn't one yet, not a clean one, but the question itself, the shape of the silence, what it contains, what it might mean. So settle in. Let the sound of this voice carry you through a landscape that is old in ways that are difficult to hold in the mind all at once. We're going to move slowly through deep time tonight, through layers of stone and sediment and human memory, looking for something that may have been deliberately hidden or accidentally lost, or simply waiting for someone to look in the right place. The gap is real, and we are going to walk the edge of it together. If stories like this are what you come here for, the deep ones, the ones that don't have tidy endings, the ones that ask more questions than they answer, then subscribe and stay close. New videos go up regularly, and each one is made to be listened to in the dark, when the mind is open and the world outside has gone quiet. Leave a comment if something here surprises you. We read them all. To understand what was lost, we need to understand what was there. The story of ancient Canada doesn't begin with the gap. It begins much earlier, in the cold and the dark of the last glacial maximum, when ice covered most of what is now this country to a depth that would have buried every building ever constructed in human history. Imagine standing at the edge of the ice sheet somewhere in what is now the American Midwest and looking north. The wall of ice you see is not something you can walk to in an afternoon. It is a geological feature so large it has its own weather systems, its own atmosphere, its own gravitational effect on the surrounding landscape. It is a continent inside a continent. That ice began retreating around 15,000 years ago, and the world it revealed was strange and extraordinary. The lakes it carved are still with us. The Great Lakes, which contain roughly 20% of all the liquid fresh water on the surface of the earth. The rivers it fed are still with us. The soil it deposited, ground from ancient bedrock and spread across the interior plains, is some of the most fertile agricultural land in the world. The ice shaped Canada in ways that are still shaping the people who live there today. But before the farmers, before the cities, before the highways and the railways and the settlements that Europeans built in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were people. There have always been people, for as long as there was land to stand on. The earliest confirmed human presence in what is now Canada dates to roughly 14,000 years ago. These are not the earliest dates proposed. Some researchers argue for human occupation going back 20,000 years or more, based on controversial sites like the Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, where cut-marked horse bones suggest that human beings were present in North America much earlier than the standard models allow. But even the conservative estimates place human beings in Canada for a very long time. 14,000 years is not a footnote. 14,000 years is longer than the entirety of recorded human history. The first Canadians were extraordinarily diverse. They were not a single culture, any more than the people of Europe today are a single culture. They had developed over thousands of years of adaptation to radically different environments, distinct technologies, distinct languages, distinct spiritual frameworks for understanding the world they inhabited. The people who learned to live on the tundra, hunting caribou and muskox in conditions that could kill an unprepared person within hours of exposure, were as different from the people who lived in the temperate rainforests of the Pacific coast as medieval Scots were from ancient Egyptians. And yet there were threads connecting them, trade routes that wound through thousands of kilometers of wilderness, along which goods moved, copper from the Lake Superior Basin, obsidian from volcanic deposits in what is now the American Northwest, marine shells from both coasts showing up deep in the continental interior. There were ideas moving along these routes too, and ceremonies, and people. Ancient Canada was not a collection of isolated cultures staring at their own feet. It was a world, a complex, interconnected world that had been functioning for a very long time before anyone from the Eastern Hemisphere arrived to look at it. This is the world that the gap disrupts. By around 6,000 years ago, 4,000 years before the Common Era, the archaeological record across much of Canada is rich and continuous. We can trace the movements of different cultural groups, watch them adapt to climate shifts, observe the transmission of technological innovations from one region to another. We can see the maritime archaic people spreading along the Atlantic coastline, building some of the oldest known ceremonial burial sites in the Western Hemisphere. We can see the shield archaic people working their way through the enormous Precambrian rock country north of the Great Lakes. We can see the plains archaics hunters following bison herds across the interior grasslands, developing communal hunting techniques of remarkable sophistication. The world of ancient Canada 6,000 years ago is alive with human presence. And then the quiet descends. If there is one culture whose disappearance from the archaeological record is both the most striking and the most poignant, it is the maritime archaic. The maritime archaic tradition represents one of the most successful and sophisticated adaptations to a coastal environment in the ancient world. For roughly 5,000 years, from approximately 9,000 years ago to around 4,000 years ago, these people occupied the Atlantic coast of what is now Canada, from Labrador in the north down through Newfoundland and the maritime provinces. They were maritime in the most complete sense of the word. Their lives were organized around the sea, around the rhythms of the ocean, around the great seasonal movements of marine mammals and fish and seabirds that the cold North Atlantic supported in extraordinary abundance. They hunted swordfish, read that again, slowly. They hunted swordfish from open boats in the North Atlantic 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. Swordfish are large, aggressive, fast, and dangerous. To hunt them required boats capable of operating in open water, weapons with sufficient mass and penetrating power to kill an animal that can weigh 500 kilograms, and the navigational knowledge to get out far enough to find them and then get back to shore safely. This is not the behavior of people who are barely surviving at the margins of their environment. This is the behavior of people who have mastered their environment completely. The burial sites the maritime archaic left behind are equally striking. The most famous is Port au Choix on the northwestern coast of Newfoundland, where excavations beginning in the 1960s revealed a cemetery containing over 100 individuals, buried with extraordinary care over a period of approximately 2,000 years. The grave goods found at Port au Choix are remarkable for what they tell us about maritime archaic belief and trade. Toggling harpoon heads made from walrus ivory, carved pendants in the shapes of animals, graphite and red ochre used to paint the bodies, killer whale effigies, and, most striking, objects made from materials that could only have come from hundreds of kilometers away, indicating active, long-distance trade networks. These were not simple people. They were not primitive. They were a sophisticated, prosperous, spiritually rich civilization that had been successfully inhabiting one of the most challenging coastal environments in the world for thousands of years. And somewhere around 4,000 years ago, they vanish. The occupations that had been continuous, the middens accumulating season after season, the burials being made, the tools being manufactured and discarded and replaced, simply stop. The hearths go cold at Port au Choix and don't restart. The characteristic tools of the maritime archaic tradition disappear from the sediment layers. The swordfish bones stop appearing in the archaeological deposits. Where did they go? This is the question that has occupied researchers for decades, and it does not have a satisfying answer. Several possibilities have been proposed. One is that the maritime archaic migrated south, merging with populations in what is now New England, and eventually being absorbed into the cultural traditions of that region. There is some evidence for this. The later red paint people of New England show certain similarities to maritime archaic traditions, but the cultural continuity is not clean enough to be conclusive. Another possibility is that the maritime archaic population collapsed due to a combination of climate change and resource depletion. Around 4,000 years ago, the North Atlantic was undergoing a significant cooling trend, and the populations of certain marine mammals, particularly the walrus, which was a critical resource for maritime archaic communities, may have shifted their ranges northward, pulling the foundation of the maritime archaic economy out from under the people who depended on it. A third possibility, one that is rarely discussed openly in academic literature but surfaces regularly in conversations between researchers, is that the maritime archaic were displaced by the arrival of a new people from the north. The pre-Dorset culture, an Arctic-adapted tradition that appears in the archaeological record of northern Canada around the same time the maritime archaic disappears from the south, seems to have been expanding southward during this period. Whether this expansion involved violent conflict, peaceful displacement, or simply the gradual replacement of one cultural tradition by another as resources shifted is unknown. What is known is that the disappearance of the maritime archaic is not a local phenomenon. It is part of something larger, something that was happening across Canada simultaneously, in environments as different from the Atlantic coast as it is possible to imagine. The most popular scientific explanation for the gap is climate, specifically a period of extreme warmth and aridity known by several names: the hepsithermal, the Holocene climatic optimum, or most commonly, the altithermal, that peaked across North America roughly 6,000 to 4,000 years ago. The altithermal was not subtle. At its height, average temperatures across much of the North American interior were several degrees Celsius warmer than they are today, and precipitation was significantly lower. The grasslands of the interior plains, which today support enormous agricultural productivity, shifted dramatically. Species ranges moved, lakes shrank, rivers changed their courses. The entire ecological architecture of the continent was rearranged. For the people living through this, and people were living through it, even if the archaeological record doesn't always show them clearly, the altithermal would have been experienced not as an abstraction, but as a slow, grinding transformation of everything they knew. The plants they gathered would have moved north or uphill to where conditions were still tolerable. The animals they hunted would have followed the plants. The rivers they fished would have run lower, warmer, and less productive. The berry patches and root grounds that had sustained communities for generations would have dried up. In the Great Plains of Canada, the evidence for the altithermal's impact is particularly stark. The bison, which were the foundation of Plains culture's subsistence economy, appear to have dramatically reduced their population during the height of the altithermal. The grasslands that sustained them became too hot and too dry, and the herds that had once blackened the horizon thinned to something much more modest. The people who had organized their entire way of life around following those herds faced a simple and brutal choice: follow the bison north into the boreal forest and tundra, where bison hunting techniques developed for the open plains would not work, or find some other way to eat. Some of them followed the bison. The archaeological record shows a thin but continuous human presence in the northern plains during the altithermal, suggesting that not everyone left, but the density of sites drops dramatically, and the cultural material from this period is sparse enough that we can only glimpse the people who stayed. A hearth here, a scatter of tools there, the bones of a meal, eaten and left to calcify in the sediment. In the eastern woodlands and along the Atlantic coast, the altithermal had different but equally significant effects. Sea levels were still rising during this period as the last of the glacial ice melted and added its water to the world's oceans. Coastlines that had been inhabited for thousands of years were drowning, slowly but inexorably, as the sea crept inland meter by meter, generation by generation. The middens and campsites and seasonal settlements of countless generations of coastal people are now sitting on the seafloor beyond the reach of most archaeological surveys. This is a point worth sitting with for a moment, because it has significant implications for how we interpret the gap. When archaeologists say that the evidence stops around 5,000 years ago, they are saying that the evidence they can find stops. The evidence they cannot find, the evidence sitting under 10 to 20 meters of cold Atlantic water, buried under decades of sediment on what are now submerged continental shelves, may tell a completely different story. The people who lived on those drowned coastlines did not disappear. Their settlements disappeared. The distinction matters. Climate, in other words, is both a potential cause of population movement and a cause of archaeological invisibility. The same forces that may have pushed people off certain landscapes also submerge those landscapes, hiding whatever traces people left behind. This makes the gap simultaneously more understandable and more mysterious, More understandable because we have a plausible mechanism for population disruption. More mysterious because the evidence that might tell us what actually happened is largely beyond our reach. But climate alone does not fully explain the gap, and some researchers have begun looking at a very different kind of catastrophe. Approximately 390 years ago, which places it squarely within the gap period in many regions of Canada. A volcano in Iceland underwent one of the largest eruptions of the Holocene epoch. The Hekla 3 eruption injected an enormous quantity of sulfur dioxide and ash into the upper atmosphere, enough to cause measurable cooling across the northern hemisphere and to leave a clear chemical signature in ice cores from both Greenland and Antarctica. But Hekla 3 was not the only major volcanic event of this period. The mid-Holocene, roughly spanning 5,000 to 3,000 years ago, saw an unusually high level of volcanic activity globally. The Bridge River tephra, deposited by a major eruption in what is now British Columbia, has been dated to approximately 250 years ago, technically at the later edge of the gap in Western Canada. The White River Ash event, which blanketed enormous areas of what is now the Yukon and Alaska, may have occurred during this same general period, though its precise dating has been revised multiple times. Volcanic winter, the phenomenon by which a large eruption injects enough material into the stratosphere to reduce solar radiation, reaching the Earth's surface, is not hypothetical. We have historical documentation of it. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia caused what contemporaries called the year without a summer in 1816. Crops failed across Europe and North America. Famine swept through regions that had been prosperous. People moved desperately looking for food. The human cost was enormous. Now imagine that scale of disruption happening not once, but multiple times over a period of several hundred years in a landscape where there were no emergency food stores, no governmental infrastructure to organize relief efforts, no global trade networks to bring food from unaffected regions. The people experiencing it would have had no framework for understanding what was happening to the sky, no way to know whether the cold and the darkness would end in a season or last for years, no way to know whether to wait or to run. Some researchers have argued that it is exactly this kind of compounded volcanic disruption, layered on top of the already significant climate stress of the Altai thermal, that is responsible for the catastrophic population movements visible in the Canadian archaeological record during this period. Not a single event, but a cascade of events, each one weakening communities that were already under stress until populations that had been stable for thousands of years finally fragmented and dispersed. There is some evidence for this in the oral traditions of First Nations peoples across Canada, traditions of a time of great darkness, of cold that came in the wrong season, of animals that disappeared and did not return for years. These appear in the recorded oral histories of multiple distinct cultural groups across the country, separated by hundreds of kilometers and several different language families. The specificity of these traditions and the fact that they appear in cultures with no documented historical contact with each other suggests that they may be preserving memory of real events rather than serving purely symbolic functions. But oral tradition is a form of evidence that academic archaeology has historically been reluctant to engage with directly, partly for methodological reasons and partly for reasons that are less comfortable to acknowledge openly. The result is that an entire category of potential evidence for what happened during the gap has been largely set aside, treated as mythology rather than as memory. This is beginning to change. A growing body of research within both archaeology and indigenous studies is exploring the ways in which oral traditions can function as long-term repositories of environmental and historical information, preserving accurate accounts of geological events that occurred thousands of years before writing was introduced to North America. Some researchers are now treating oral traditions as a primary source, not as evidence to be confirmed by archaeology, but as evidence in their own right, deserving the same careful analysis that would be applied to any other form of historical documentation. What those traditions say about the time of the gap is, to put it gently, unsettling. The Anishinaabe are one of the largest First Nations groups in Canada, occupying a traditional territory that spans from the Great Lakes westward across the boreal forest to the plains. Their oral traditions are among the most extensively documented of any indigenous group in North America, partly because of the work of early ethnographers in the 19th and early 20th centuries who recorded them, and partly because of the efforts of Anishinaabe scholars and elders who have worked to preserve and share them. Within the Anishinaabe oral tradition, there are accounts of a time, set deep in the past, before the current world order was established, when the world went through a profound disruption. The details vary across different communities and storytellers, as is appropriate for a living oral tradition, rather than a fixed text, but certain elements recur with remarkable consistency. The accounts speak of a time when the great animals, the megafauna whose bones now lie in geological deposits across North America, were still present. They speak of a period of great cold that followed a period of great heat. They speak of waters rising and then falling, of landscapes being transformed in ways that living memory could not account for. And they speak of a time of great human movement, when the ancestors were compelled to leave places they had lived for generations and travel to new lands, guided by spiritual knowledge, and in some accounts by specific leaders or figures who carried the memory of what the old world had been. Some Anishinaabe scholars have interpreted these traditions as encoding geological memory, as preserving, in narrative form, information about events that occurred during the period we call the gap. The rising waters match the sea level rise that followed glacial retreat. The great cold following great heat matches the climate pattern of the mid-Holocene. The movement of peoples matches what the archaeological record suggests about population dispersal during this period. The Cree, whose traditional territories stretch across an enormous arc of boreal forest from what is now Quebec to Alberta, have traditions that speak of a time when the land itself was different, when the trees were not where they are now, when certain animals lived in places where they no longer exist, when the rivers ran differently. Cree elders, when asked about these traditions in the context of environmental history research, have consistently described them not as mythology, but as history, as accounts of things that actually happened, preserved in story, because story was the technology available for preserving them. The Haida, whose ancestral homeland is the archipelago now called Haida Gwaii off the coast of British Columbia, have oral traditions that describe events corresponding to geological processes that are now confirmed by science. The Haida have traditions of a great flood, not the symbolic flood of religious allegory, but a specific, historically located flooding event in which particular landmarks were submerged and specific communities were displaced. When archaeologists surveyed the underwater terrain around Haida Gwaii, they found exactly what the traditions described: submerged landscapes, drowned forest, the remnants of what had clearly been inhabited coastline, now sitting under the cold Pacific water. The Haida oral traditions locate these events in a time frame that corresponds, when examined carefully, to the period of rapid sea level rise following the last glacial maximum, a period that overlaps with the early portion of the gap. This is not a coincidence. This is a culture that has been preserving accurate geographical and historical information for 10,000 years in a medium that most Western scientists had dismissed as unreliable. The implications of this are significant. If oral traditions can accurately preserve information about sea level changes that occurred 10,000 years ago, they may also be preserving information about what happened to their ancestors during the gap. And the story those traditions tell, across multiple unrelated cultural groups in different languages from different geographical locations, is consistent in its broad outline. Something happened, something large and disruptive and hard to understand, and the people had to move, and not all of them made it. What that something was, the oral traditions do not always specify clearly. Some speak of conflict, of wars between peoples that resulted in the dispersal of the losing side across territories they had not previously occupied. Some speak of disease, of plagues that emptied communities that had been full. Some speak of environmental catastrophe, of floods, of cold, of the failure of familiar resources, and some speak of things that are harder to categorize, of disturbances in the relationship between the human world and the spirit world, of times when the usual agreements that govern that relationship broke down. We should not be too quick to dismiss the spiritual explanations as less than historical, for a culture in which the spiritual and the material are not separated, in which every ecological relationship has a spiritual dimension, and in which the breakdown of ecological relationships is understood as a spiritual failure as much as a physical one. A spiritual explanation for catastrophe may be the most accurate possible description of what was experienced. The Canadian Plains present one of the most dramatic examples of the gap in the entire country. The region we are talking about stretches from what is now Winnipeg westward to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, and from the American border north to where the grasslands give way to boreal forest. It is a landscape of enormous sky and subtle beauty, where the light in the late afternoon turns the grass a color that has no precise name in English, and where the silence on a still day is so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat. Before the gap, this landscape was busy. The old women's buffalo jump near Carmangay, Alberta, the Majorville medicine wheel on the Bow River, the ancient campsites along the Qu'Appelle Valley in Saskatchewan. The archaeological record of the pre-gap plains is rich enough to suggest a landscape well inhabited and thoroughly known. People had been living here for thousands of years, had developed sophisticated techniques for hunting bison in a grassland environment, had built ceremonial structures and maintained sacred sites, and developed trade relationships with neighboring regions. The Oxbow culture, which occupied the northern plains from roughly 6,000 to 4,000 years ago, is one of the best documented of the pre-gap traditions. Oxbow people made a distinctive style of projectile point, side-notched, carefully pressure-flaked, often made from high-quality stone brought from considerable distances, that allows archaeologists to track their distribution across the landscape. They hunted bison communally, using drive lanes to channel herds toward natural or constructed kill sites. They processed bison carcasses efficiently, using virtually every part of the animal, and they moved seasonally across the landscape in a pattern that was adapted to the movements of the herds and the availability of plant foods. And then, around 4,000 years ago, the Oxbow culture disappears. The term disappears is doing a lot of work in that sentence. What actually happens in the archaeological record is that the characteristic Oxbow point types stop appearing in new contexts. The sites that had been producing Oxbow material stop producing it. New sites don't fill in the gap. For a period that researchers estimate at between 200 and 500 years in different parts of the plains, the archaeological record is nearly empty. When the record resumes, the culture that emerges is different. The Pelican Lake culture, which appears in the northern plains after the gap, has different projectile point styles, different site types, apparently different subsistence strategies. The people who made Pelican Lake artifacts were doing things differently than the people who made Oxbow artifacts, suggesting that the population that reoccupied the northern plains after the gap was not simply the descendant population of the people who had been there before. Where did the Oxbow people go? The most widely accepted answer is north, into the boreal forest and the Precambrian shield country, where the climate remained more tolerable during the altithermal. The forest would have offered different but still viable subsistence resources: woodland caribou instead of plains bison, lake fish instead of river fish, forest berries and roots instead of grassland plants. The people who made this transition would have had to learn a new landscape essentially from scratch, adapting technologies developed for an open grassland environment to a forested one. There is some archaeological evidence for this. Shield archaic sites in the boreal forest country north of the plains show some continuity with pre-gap plains traditions, suggesting that at least some of the people who left the grasslands during the altithermal moved north rather than south. But the evidence is not conclusive, and the transition between the two traditions is not clean enough to establish with confidence that we are looking at the same people adapting to new conditions rather than completely different populations filling in territory that had been abandoned. The Pelican Lake people who returned to the plains after the gap are themselves something of a mystery. Their origins are debated. Their relationship to the Oxbow people who preceded them is unclear. They appear in the record somewhat suddenly, already adapted to plains conditions, as if they had come from somewhere where they had developed the cultural toolkit necessary for life on the grasslands. Where that somewhere was is not obvious from the archaeological record alone. Some researchers have pointed to the mountains. The foothills and valleys of the Rocky Mountain system, particularly in what is now southern Alberta and British Columbia, may have served as a refuge during the most extreme period of the altithermal. The mountains moderate climate in ways that the open plains do not. Elevational gradients provide access to multiple ecological zones within a short vertical distance. Streams fed by glacial meltwater remain cold and productive even during warm, dry periods, and the mountains themselves create microclimates of greater reliability than the surrounding lowlands. People who retreated into the mountains during the worst of the altithermal may have maintained cultural continuity in a refuge zone, then returned to the plains when conditions improved. This is a plausible hypothesis, but it remains a hypothesis. The evidence is suggestive rather than definitive, and the precise sequence of events, who left, when, where they went, and whether the people who came back were the same people or their distant descendants, is still actively debated. North of the plains, north of the Great Lakes, north of the St. Lawrence River Valley, stretches the Canadian Shield, the largest exposed area of Precambrian bedrock on the planet. It is an ancient, worn-down landscape, the eroded roots of mountains that were once as tall as the Himalayas, but have been ground down over 3 billion years to a rounded, lake-studded, forest-covered plain of extraordinary geological age. The shield covers roughly half of Canada. Understanding what happened on it during the gap is central to understanding the gap as a whole. The shield archaic tradition, which occupied this vast territory from roughly 7,000 to 3,000 years ago, is in many ways the least studied of the major pre-gap Canadian cultures. This is partly a function of visibility. The shield, with its thin soils and acidic lake chemistry, is not kind to organic materials. Bone, wood, plant matter, all of these decay rapidly in shield conditions, leaving archaeologists with stone tools and not much else to work with. Reconstructing the lives of Shield archaic people from the surviving evidence requires drawing inferences from very limited data. What we can say with some confidence is that the Shield archaic people were extraordinarily adaptable. They had to be. The Shield is not a single environment, but a mosaic of micro-environments, bog and marsh and upland forest and rocky shore and deep lake, each of which presents different challenges and different opportunities. The people who lived here successfully for thousands of years had developed a detailed, intimate knowledge of this landscape that allowed them to exploit its resources efficiently across all seasons. They fished. The Shield is dotted with thousands of lakes and threaded with rivers, and its cold, clear waters were extraordinarily productive. Pike and walleye and lake trout and whitefish and sturgeon, fish that could be caught through the ice in winter and netted in massive quantities during the spawning runs of spring and fall. And fishing may have been the single most important subsistence activity for Shield archaic communities, providing the caloric foundation that everything else was built on. They also hunted. Woodland caribou moved across the Shield in large seasonal herds, predictable enough in their movements that communities could plan hunting activities around them. Moose were present in significant numbers. Beaver, an animal whose importance to later Canadian economic history needs no elaboration, were abundant in every waterway. The Shield offered enough protein resources that communities could be relatively sedentary, at least seasonally, building up food stores during the productive seasons to carry them through the lean ones. The evidence for Shield archaic trade connections is particularly interesting. Copper objects manufactured from native copper, sourced from the Lake Superior Basin, appear at Shield archaic sites, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest copper deposits. Marine shells from both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts appear in Shield interior sites, indicating that the Shield was not isolated from the broader North American trade network, but was actively connected to it. And then, around 4,000 years ago, the Shield archaic record thins dramatically, not everywhere and not all at once. Some researchers have identified what appears to be continuous occupation at certain favorable locations. River narrows where fish were easily caught, lake shores with good access to multiple resource zones, even during the most archaeologically empty period of the gap. But the broader pattern is unmistakable. The density of Shield archaic sites dropped sharply around 4,000 years ago and does not recover to anything like its pre-gap levels for several centuries. The causes here are somewhat different from the plain situation. The Shield did not become desiccated during the altithermal. It is too far north and too lake-rich to dry out in the way the interior plains did. But the altithermal did affect the Shield in other ways. The tree line moved northward, pushing the tundra-adapted caribou herds that had been accessible from northern Shield communities into ranges farther north. Lake levels fluctuated. The productivity of the fishery may have been affected by warmer water temperatures, and the populations living here, like populations everywhere in Canada during this period, may have been vulnerable to a combination of stresses that individually would have been manageable, but in combination proved overwhelming. There is also the question of disease, a factor that rarely enters discussions of pre-contact population dynamics, but which some researchers have begun to take more seriously. Pre-contact North American populations were not isolated from disease. They experienced epidemics of illnesses that we can sometimes identify from skeletal evidence. Tuberculosis, certain types of inflammatory disease, conditions consistent with nutritional deficiency. A major epidemic moving through a population already stressed by climate change and resource depletion could produce exactly the kind of rapid, widespread population collapse that the gap represents? We don't know. We may never know with certainty. The shield keeps its secrets well, locked in acid soil and under cold water, and in the memories of communities that experienced colonization as a disruption of their own knowledge system severe enough to compromise the transmission of deep historical memory. The gap on the shield is real, and it is large, and its causes remain genuinely unclear. There is a growing field of research that may hold more answers about the gap than any amount of excavation on land. It is called maritime archaeology or underwater archaeology, and it is concerned with what lies beneath the water, specifically with what lies on the seafloor and lake beds of North America in the landscapes that were once above water and inhabited by human beings before the rising seas of the post-glacial period swallowed them. The scale of what we are talking about is difficult to convey without some numbers. At the height of the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, sea levels globally were roughly 120 to 130 meters lower than they are today. As the ice melted, the seas rose, not smoothly and continuously, but in pulses, with periods of rapid rise punctuating longer periods of relative stability. By 5,000 years ago, the beginning of the gap period, sea levels were approaching their current levels, but the process was not yet complete. An enormous amount of coastline had already been drowned. What that means in practical terms is that the coastal landscapes that human beings had been inhabiting for thousands of years, the landscapes where the archaeological record for pre-gap coastal cultures should be richest, since coastlines are among the most productive and therefore most densely inhabited environments on Earth, are now sitting underwater. In the case of the Maritimes and the Atlantic coast of Canada, the drowned landscape is substantial. What is now the Gulf of St. Lawrence was once partly dry land. The continental shelf extending east from Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, the Grand Banks, was once a broad coastal plain, part of which was above water. The river systems that now empty into the Gulf of St. Lawrence once extended across that plain, and the people who lived along those rivers and on those coastal plains left evidence of their presence there. That evidence is now on the seafloor. The Haida-Gwaii underwater survey, which we touched on earlier, provides a model for what such investigations can reveal. When researchers began systematically surveying the underwater terrain around the archipelago using sonar mapping and eventually submersible vehicles, they found a landscape that matched precisely what the Haida oral traditions described. Submerged forests, ancient shorelines, the remnants of what had been inhabited coastal terrain. They found artifacts, tools, the remains of shellfish middens, sitting on the seafloor at depths corresponding to where the shoreline would have been during different periods of the post-glacial sea level rise. Similar surveys along the Atlantic coast of Canada have found comparable evidence. Stone tools have been recovered from the seafloor off Nova Scotia at depths of up to 30 meters, in positions that would have been dry land or very shallow coastal water several thousand years ago. The distribution of these finds suggests that what is now underwater was once intensively inhabited, not by small scattered hunting bands, but by communities substantial enough to leave dense artifact scatters across the landscape. What does this mean for the gap? It means that a significant portion of the population of pre-gap Canada was living in landscapes that are now inaccessible to conventional archaeology. When the sea rose and drowned those landscapes, the communities living on them were forced to move inland, to higher ground, to territories that were already occupied by other peoples who had their own established relationships with the land. The arrival of large numbers of displaced coastal people into territories that were already inhabited may have produced exactly the kind of social disruption that could fragment communities, exhaust local resources, and produce the population level crashes visible in the archaeological record. The rising seas were not a metaphor. They were a physical force that relocated populations on a massive scale, compressing people into smaller and smaller areas of habitable land, and doing so over a period of thousands of years at a pace slow enough to be almost imperceptible to any individual generation, but fast enough to have dramatic consequences over the span of a century. In the Pacific Northwest, a similar process was occurring, but with additional complications from ongoing tectonic activity. The Pacific coast of Canada is geologically active. The Queen Charlotte Fault, the Cascadia subduction zone, and the combined effects of rising seas, tectonic subsidence, and occasional seismic events would have made the coastal landscape profoundly unstable during the gap period. Evidence for major tsunamis from the Cascadia Fault during this period has been found in sediment deposits at multiple locations along the coast, suggesting that catastrophic wave events may have periodically devastated coastal communities that were already under stress from sea level rise and climate change. The story of the gap, in other words, is at least partly a story of water, of landscapes being swallowed and communities being displaced and people being forced to find new ways to live in a world that was changing faster than any human memory could track. Ancient DNA research has transformed archaeology in the past decade in ways that would have seemed impossible to previous generations of researchers. The ability to extract genetic material from bones and teeth thousands of years old, sequence it, and compare it to modern populations and to other ancient genomes from around the world has opened a window into the past that no amount of stone tool analysis or site distribution mapping could provide. What ancient DNA research has revealed about the population history of Canada during and around the gap period is, to put it mildly, complicated. The broad outline of North American population genetics is now fairly well established. The initial founders of the Americas were a population derived from northeastern Asian ancestry, who crossed into the Americas via Beringia, the land bridge and surrounding region that connected Asia and North America during the last glacial maximum, in at least two major pulses, the first of which occurred perhaps 15,000 years ago or earlier. These founders were not a large group. Genetic estimates suggest that the founding population of the Americas was relatively small, perhaps a few thousand individuals, but they expanded rapidly once they reached the ice-free landscapes of the southern continent and eventually North America. Within North America, there was subsequent genetic differentiation as populations adapted to different environments and were separated by geography and distance. By the time of the gap, 5,000 years ago, North American populations showed considerable genetic diversity, reflecting thousands of years of local adaptation and isolation. Different regions had different genetic signatures, corresponding to the different cultural traditions we can identify archaeologically. And then, like the archaeological record, the genetic record shows something unusual during the gap period. In studies comparing ancient genomes from before the gap to genomes from after the gap at the same geographical locations, researchers have found evidence of significant population replacement. The people living in certain regions of Canada after the gap were not closely related to the people who had been living there before. Different populations with different genetic ancestry were occupying the same territories. This is striking. It is one thing to say that people moved during the gap, that familiar cultures disappeared and new ones emerged. That could be explained by cultural change within a continuous population, the same people adopting new technologies and abandoning old ones, becoming archaeologically invisible to us in the process. But genetic replacement is harder to explain as cultural change. When the DNA tells you that the people buried in a cemetery 3,000 years ago are not closely related to the people buried in a cemetery 4,000 years ago in the same place, you're looking at population turnover, not just cultural change. What caused that population turnover is the question. The most conservative interpretation is migration and demographic replacement. Populations from elsewhere expanded into territories vacated by the gap, bringing with them new genetic signatures, new cultural traditions, and new ways of understanding their relationship to the land. This is consistent with what we see in the archaeological record, the appearance of new cultural traditions in the post-gap period. But it raises the further question of where these new populations came from. One candidate is the Arctic. The pre-Dorset culture, which we mentioned briefly in the context of the maritime Archaic, represented a population with a genetic signature that appears to have expanded southward during the gap period. Pre-Dorset people were genetically related to the ancestral population of modern Inuit and Yupik peoples, and they were spreading through territories that had previously been occupied by culturally and perhaps genetically distinct populations. The collision between expanding pre-Dorset populations and retreating or declining southern populations may be part of what produced the genetic turnover visible in the gap period record. Another candidate is the Pacific Coast. The Pacific coastal route into the Americas, a pathway along the kelp highway of the North Pacific coast, has become increasingly well supported as an alternative or complement to the interior ice-free corridor route. Populations moving along this coastal route from Alaska southward may have been carrying genetic signatures different from those of populations that had arrived via the interior, and the expansion of these coastal route populations into interior territories during the gap period may be part of what we see in the genetic replacement signal. Neither explanation is fully satisfying. The genetic data are fragmentary. We have ancient genomes from relatively few individuals, from relatively few locations, spread across a vast and diverse landscape, and the models for interpreting what we do have are still being developed. The honest answer is that the genetics confirm that something significant happened to the populations of Canada during the gap period, involving both population movement and probably population loss, but they do not yet tell us exactly what that something was. What they do tell us, unambiguously, is that the gap was real. It was not an artifact of insufficient sampling or poor site preservation. Something happened to the people of ancient Canada 5,000 years ago, and it left a mark in their DNA that we can still read today. If you want to understand what the gap created, look at what followed it. The Dorset culture is one of the most fascinating and poignant in the entire archaeological record of the Americas. It occupied the Arctic and subarctic regions of Canada from roughly 500 BC to somewhere between 1000 and 1500 AD, a run of approximately 1500 to 2000 years, and it left behind an artistic and material tradition of considerable sophistication and beauty. Dorset ivory carvings, in particular, are among the most extraordinary objects produced by any pre-contact North American culture. Tiny figures of humans and animals, rendered with an understanding of form and psychological presence that is genuinely arresting. The Dorset people were the inheritors of the pre-Dorset tradition that had been expanding through the Arctic and subarctic during the gap period. They adapted to Arctic conditions with remarkable effectiveness, developing specialized technologies for hunting marine mammals through the sea ice, for building shelter in an environment where wood was essentially absent, for extracting sufficient calories from a landscape that seems, to an unprepared outside observer, almost impossibly barren. The Dorset were also, according to the oral traditions of the Inuit who came after them, a strange and somewhat fearful people. Inuit oral tradition describes the Dorset, whom they call the Tunit, or Sivulirmut, the first people, as beings of great physical strength but unusual temperament, powerful, skilled, but somehow timid, easily frightened, reluctant to resist when the Thule people arrived from the west and began displacing them from their territories. The traditions describe the Dorset not as enemies defeated in battle, but as a people who simply gave way, who retreated before the Thule expansion without significant resistance and eventually disappeared. The Thule, the ancestors of modern Inuit, arrived in northern Canada from Alaska around 1000 AD, roughly contemporaneous with the medieval warm period, which opened new navigable water in the Arctic and allowed the Thule to expand their range eastward rapidly. They brought with them a material culture technologically superior to the Dorset tradition in certain key respects. Larger boats capable of hunting the great whales, dog sleds for rapid overland travel, iron obtained from meteorites or from trade with Norse contacts, a broader and more flexible toolkit for Arctic survival. The Dorset disappeared from the archaeological record within a few centuries of the Thule arrival. Where they went is another of the great unanswered questions of Canadian archaeological history. They may have been absorbed into the Thule population through intermarriage and cultural assimilation, though genetic studies suggest this was not the primary process, since modern Inuit show very little Dorset ancestry. They may have been displaced into increasingly marginal territories and eventually died out through the cumulative effects of resource competition and demographic pressure. They may have fallen victim to diseases introduced through contact with the Thule, or, later, with Norse visitors. In any case, the Dorset are gone, leaving behind only their carvings and their tools, and the memory of them preserved in the oral traditions of the people who replaced them. They are themselves an echo of the Gap, a culture that emerged in the space the Gap created, flourished for nearly 2,000 years, and then vanished as completely as the maritime archaic people who had preceded them by several thousand years. There is something deeply melancholy about this pattern if you allow yourself to feel it. Cultures arising, developing their own ways of being in the world, building their own understanding of what it means to be human in a particular landscape, and then disappearing, not always in dramatic catastrophe, but sometimes in the slow, quiet way that a fire goes out when the wood runs low. The Gap is not unique in Canadian history. It is part of a pattern of emergence and disappearance that runs through the entire deep past of this country, a pattern that tells us something important about the fragility of human communities in the face of environmental and demographic pressure. In 1996, 2 college students wading in the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington, stumbled across a human skull partially eroding out of the riverbank. The skull turned out to be ancient. Radiocarbon dating eventually placed it at approximately 8,500 years old, and the nearly complete skeleton recovered in subsequent excavations became one of the most studied and most contested sets of human remains ever found in North America. Kennewick Man, as the individual came to be called, sparked a legal and scientific controversy that lasted nearly 20 years and touched on fundamental questions about who the first Americans were, how they got here, and who their descendants, if they have living descendants, might be. The controversy centered on the morphology of the skull. To some physical anthropologists, the skull of Kennewick Man did not look like the skulls of modern Native American populations. It looked different in ways that were difficult to characterize simply, but that some researchers interpreted as evidence for a different ancestral population, possibly related to the Ainu of Japan or to early populations of Southeast Asia, or to some founding group that was distinct from the ancestors of most modern indigenous Americans. The implications were significant. If the earliest inhabitants of North America were not the ancestors of modern indigenous peoples, then the story of the peopling of the Americas was more complex than the standard model suggested, involving multiple distinct founding populations, possibly from different source populations in the Old World, arriving in the Americas over an extended period of time. And if that were true, then the populations that occupied Canada before the gap might have been ancestrally distinct from the populations that occupied it after, a distinction that would put a very different face on the gap itself. Ancient DNA eventually settled at least part of the controversy. Genetic analysis published in 2015 found that Kennewick man was most closely related to modern Native American populations, particularly groups in the Pacific Northwest. He was not a representative of a separate founding population, but belonged to the same broad ancestral group as modern Indigenous Americans. But the controversy revealed something important. Beyond the specific question of Kennewick man's ancestry, it revealed the depth of scientific uncertainty about the population history of the Americas, and it revealed the extent to which that uncertainty intersected with politically and legally significant questions about Indigenous identity, land rights, and the relationship between scientific knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. These questions are directly relevant to the gap. If the population history of the Americas is more complex than the standard model suggests, if there were multiple founding events, if populations were replaced multiple times, if the people living in any given location 5,000 years ago were not necessarily the direct ancestors of the people living there today, then the politics of the gap become complicated. Who are the descendants of the people who disappeared? Are the First Nations communities of modern Canada the heirs of the pre-gap cultures? Or did the gap represent a break in ancestry as well as a break in cultural continuity? These questions do not have simple answers. Modern genetic research suggests that the relationship between pre-gap and post-gap populations varied considerably by region. In some areas, there appears to be genetic continuity. The people who were there before the gap were the ancestors, through disrupted but unbroken lines of descent, of the people who were there after. In other areas, the genetic signal suggests significant replacement. The answer is probably different in different places, and the truth of the matter is embedded in a past complex enough to resist any simple narrative. What is clear is that the gap was not simply a matter of people moving around within a continuous cultural tradition. It was a period of genuine discontinuity, cultural, demographic, and in some places genetic, that separates the ancient world of Canada from everything that came after. The people who emerged from the gap were different from the people who entered it. They had survived something, and what they built after surviving it was different from what had existed before. The cultures of post-gap Canada, the woodland cultures of the East, the plains cultures of the interior, the northwest coast cultures of the Pacific, the Arctic cultures of the far north, are not simply continuations of their pre-gap predecessors. They are new creations, built in the aftermath of disruption, by people who were adapting to a changed landscape with changed populations and changed relationships to the land. This does not diminish those cultures. If anything, it makes them more remarkable. They were built under conditions of stress and disruption by people who had lost much of what their predecessors had accumulated over thousands of years, and they were built with such skill and such commitment that many of them lasted in recognizable form until the arrival of Europeans in the 15th and 16th centuries, a span of 2,000 to 3,000 years of cultural continuity that we should not be too quick to take for granted. There is a rock shelter in the hills of southwestern Pennsylvania, not far from the West Virginia border, that has been at the center of one of the longest-running controversies in North American archaeology. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, excavated by James Adivasio, beginning in 1973, has produced evidence for human occupation that, if the radiocarbon dates are accepted at face value, pushes the arrival of humans in the Americas back to somewhere between 14,000 and 19,000 years ago, well before the standard Clovis first model would allow. The controversy over Meadowcroft has never been fully resolved. Critics have raised concerns about the possibility of contamination of the radiocarbon samples by ancient carbon from coal deposits in the surrounding geology. Adovasio and his team have defended the dates vigorously, arguing that the stratigraphy of the site is clean and the dates reliable. The debate has gone back and forth for 50 years without reaching a definitive conclusion. Meadowcroft is relevant to the gap for a specific reason. If humans were present in eastern North America before the Clovis period, before the standard model allows, then the pre-gap archaeological record of Canada may be significantly denser than we currently recognize. Populations with deep time depth in a region are more likely to have developed complex, stable cultural traditions, and the disruption of such traditions during the gap would represent a more significant loss than the disruption of more recently established populations. But there is a broader point here about how archaeological evidence is interpreted, and it is worth making explicitly. The archaeological record is not a complete or unbiased sample of the past. It is a sample skewed by preservation conditions, by what has been excavated, by what has been published, and by the theoretical frameworks that archaeologists bring to their interpretations. Sites that challenge the dominant model tend to receive more critical scrutiny than sites that confirm it. Dates that push origins back further than the standard model allows are treated with greater suspicion than dates that fall within expected ranges. This is not necessarily a conspiracy. It is simply the normal operation of scientific skepticism, applied consistently, but not always equally. The result is that our picture of pre-gap Canada is probably less complete than it appears. There are almost certainly sites we haven't found, evidence we haven't looked for, interpretations we haven't considered. The gap, in other words, may be partly a gap in our knowledge, rather than purely a gap in the past. This is not a counsel of despair. It is an acknowledgement that the story of ancient Canada is still being written, that the evidence is still being gathered, and that the conclusions we draw from current evidence should be held with appropriate humility. The history of archaeology is a history of certainties overturned, of models revised, of things that everyone knew turning out to be wrong. What was once the Clovis first consensus, the idea that the Americas were populated in a single wave of migration approximately 13,000 years ago via the interior ice-free corridor, has been substantially modified, though not entirely abandoned, by a combination of new site discoveries, improved dating techniques, and advances in ancient DNA research. The model that replaces it is more complex, involving multiple founding events, coastal routes as well as interior routes, and a founding population history that may extend back much earlier than the original Clovis first model allowed. The gap may undergo a similar revision as new evidence accumulates. The 5,000-year gap that we can currently identify in the record may turn out to be several smaller, more localized gaps rather than a single continent-wide event. Or it may turn out to be even more dramatic than the current evidence suggests, a more complete and more rapid population disruption than we have been willing to contemplate. We don't know yet. That is both the frustrating and the exciting truth about this story. What we know is that something happened. The record shows it clearly enough that denying it would be dishonest. The shape of what happened, its causes, its geography, its human cost, is what remains to be understood. By around 3,000 years ago, the gap is closing, not all at once and not everywhere simultaneously, but across much of Canada the archaeological record begins to thicken again. New cultures are emerging, new traditions are developing, and the landscape that had been so quiet during the deepest part of the gap is coming alive with human presence once more. In the eastern woodlands, the great forests that stretch from the Atlantic coast to the edge of the plains, from the Great Lakes north to the Boreal, what emerges from the gap is the early woodland tradition, characterized by the first appearance of pottery in the Canadian archaeological record, and by a gradual intensification of ceremonial life that would eventually produce some of the most elaborate mortuary practices and long-distance exchange networks of any culture in North America, north of Mexico. Pottery changes everything, or at least it changes a great deal. The ability to cook in a sealed container, to make soups and stews, to leach toxins from plants that are nutritious but inedible raw, to store liquids and semi-liquids through periods of cold, significantly expands the range of foods available to a community and the nutritional value that can be extracted from those foods. Pottery is heavy and fragile, which means that people who use it extensively are less mobile than people who don't. You can't carry a large ceramic vessel on a long hunting trip. The appearance of pottery in the archaeological record is thus often taken as a signal of increasing sedentism, of communities that are spending more time in one place, building deeper relationships with specific landscapes, and investing in the kind of long-term resource management that requires permanence. The emergence of pottery in the Canadian archaeological record after the gap is part of a broader pattern of increasing complexity in post-gap cultures. Burial practices become more elaborate. Evidence for long-distance trade, including eventually the extraordinary reach of the Hopewell Exchange network centered in the Ohio Valley, which extended its tendrils of trade goods into what is now southern Ontario, becomes more visible. The size of individual sites increases, suggesting larger communities, more concentrated populations, more intensive land use. This is, in some sense, a story of recovery. The gap disrupted something, and what we are watching in the post-gap period is the long, slow process of rebuilding, of communities reestablishing stable relationships with landscapes, of trade networks reconnecting regions that had been isolated from each other during the disruption, of populations growing back to pre-gap densities and beyond. But it is not simply a return to what had been before. The post-gap woodland cultures are not the pre-gap woodland cultures with the gap edited out. They are genuinely new creations, built on different foundations, organized around different relationships to the land. The pottery that is so characteristic of early woodland culture was unknown in eastern Canada before the gap, or if it existed, the evidence for it has not yet been found. It appears to have been introduced from the south, from traditions developing in what is now the American Midwest, suggesting that the post-gap repopulation of eastern Canada involved people and ideas moving northward from regions that had remained more continuously occupied during the gap period. This pattern of post-gap Canadian cultures showing strong connections to traditions developing further south in the United States rather than clear continuity with their own pre-gap predecessors is one of the things that most strongly argues for genuine population replacement rather than simple cultural change during the gap. If the gap had been merely a period when people were present but culturally inactive, if they had simply stopped making the things that archaeologists can find without actually disappearing, then we would expect the post-gap cultures to show continuity with their predecessors. Instead, we see discontinuity, new technologies, new artistic styles, new ceremonial practices, new trade connections. The people who built early woodland Canada were not, in a meaningful cultural sense, the same people as those who had preceded them. And yet, and this is the part that is hardest to hold in the mind at once. Some of the communities of post-Gap Canada are the ancestors of communities that are still here. The Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Mi'kmaq, the people of the Northwest Coast, and the Arctic. All of these living communities have roots that extend back through the post-Gap period into a past that, for all its disruptions, is their past. The Gap is part of their history, even if the exact nature of what it was remains unclear. Their ancestors came through it, and what their ancestors preserved, and what their ancestors built in the aftermath, is part of what has been transmitted to them. The northwest coast of North America, the region stretching from what is now Northern California up through Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia to southern Alaska, is, in anthropological terms, one of the most extraordinary places in the world. The cultures that developed here in the millennia before European contact achieved levels of social complexity, artistic achievement, and material wealth that are typically associated with agricultural societies, without any reliance on agriculture at all. The Northwest Coast cultures were sustained by the sea. The cold upwelling waters of the North Pacific are among the most productive marine environments on Earth. Salmon run in the rivers in numbers that were, before the industrial age, almost incomprehensible. Estimates for pre-contact salmon runs in major Pacific Northwest. River systems run into the hundreds of millions of individual fish per year. Add to this the abundance of halibut and rockfish and herring and smelt, the great whales and sea lions and harbor seals, the shellfish beds that could be harvested without leaving the beach, and you have a food system of extraordinary richness and reliability, one capable of supporting dense, permanent communities without any need to cultivate plants. The cultural achievement built on this foundation was remarkable. The carving traditions of the Northwest Coast, expressed in totem poles, house posts, canoes, masks, boxes, bowls, and 100 other forms, represent one of the great artistic traditions of humanity. The potlatch system, in which wealth was redistributed through elaborate gift-giving ceremonies that established and reinforced social relationships, was a form of economic organization as sophisticated in its own way as anything developed in the Old World. The oral literature of Northwest Coast cultures, the narratives that encoded historical memory, geographical knowledge, spiritual understanding, and social law, was of extraordinary richness and complexity. All of this raises a question about the gap. Did the Northwest Coast experience the gap at all? The answer is complicated, and it varies by subregion. The broad archaeological picture for the Northwest Coast during the gap period is one of significant disruption but not complete absence. Unlike the plains, which show very thin occupation during the worst of the altithermal, and unlike parts of the Maritimes, where the maritime archaic tradition essentially disappears from the record, the Northwest Coast shows continuity of occupation at many sites, with evidence for cultural change, but not complete cultural replacement. Part of this difference may be explained by the nature of the Northwest Coast environment during the gap period. The altithermal, which caused such severe desiccation on the interior plains, had somewhat different effects on the Pacific coast. The maritime climate of the coast is moderated by the ocean, which resists temperature extremes more effectively than the continental interior. Sea surface temperatures in the North Pacific, while they fluctuated during the Holocene, did not change dramatically, enough to severely reduce the productivity of the marine ecosystem. Salmon runs may have been affected by changes in river temperature and flow, but they did not disappear entirely. Nevertheless, the Northwest Coast archaeological record does show a significant thinning of sites and apparent population reduction during the gap period. Shell middens, the most common type of archaeological site on the coast, show gaps in their accumulation during certain periods. Some sites show evidence of abandonment and reoccupation. The overall density of archaeological evidence for the gap period is lower than for the periods immediately before and after. What this suggests is that the northwest coast was not immune to whatever was happening across Canada during the gap, but that it was less severely affected than other regions. The marine resource base may have served as a buffer, maintaining enough food security to prevent the kind of catastrophic population collapse visible elsewhere. But the coast was not entirely sheltered, and the disruptions visible in its archaeological record are real. The most significant gap period disruption on the northwest coast may have been demographic rather than climatic. The effects of population movement from inland regions as people displaced from the plains and the interior forests moved toward the coast in search of more reliable food resources. If large numbers of people were moving toward the coast during the worst of the altithermal, the coast's existing populations would have faced sudden, severe competition for resources that had previously been theirs alone. The resulting tensions, expressed in conflict, in displacement, in the disruption of established social relationships, may be what we are seeing in the Northwest Coast Gap Period archaeological record. We need to pause for a moment and address something that is not directly part of the gap, but that is often brought into discussions of ancient Canadian history in ways that are not always helpful. The Norse presence in North America, which is real, documented, and extraordinary, but which is sometimes invoked to suggest a more dramatic European influence on pre-contact North American cultures than the evidence actually supports. The Norse did come to Canada. This is not speculation. It is archaeological fact, established by the excavation of L'Anse aux Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland, where a Norse settlement was identified in the 1960s and has been extensively excavated since. The site dates to approximately 1000 AD, roughly the same period as the medieval warm period, when warming Arctic temperatures opened navigable sea routes that allowed the Thule people to expand eastward from Alaska into Canada. The Norse arriving from the east and the Thule arriving from the west were both taking advantage of the same climate window. L'Anse aux Meadows is the only confirmed Norse site in North America outside Greenland. It is not, however, the only place where Norse presence has been proposed. Researchers have identified what appears to be Norse-produced copper at several indigenous sites in the Canadian Arctic, and there are intriguing suggestions of Norse artifacts at sites farther south. A Norse spindle whorl found at a site in Baffin Island, a possible Norse contact site on the Labrador coast. The oral traditions of the Inuit describe encounters with strangers called kalunat, pale-skinned, bearded, strangely clothed, who arrived in large boats and behaved in unpredictable ways. These accounts may preserve memory of Norse contacts, but the Norse presence in Canada, fascinating as it is, was brief and limited in its long-term effects. The settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows appears to have been occupied for only a short period, perhaps a decade or two at most, before being abandoned. The Norse did not establish a permanent foothold in North America north of Greenland. They did not introduce technologies that transformed indigenous cultures. They did not bring diseases that caused population collapses comparable to what would happen after 1492. Their presence in Canada is a remarkable footnote in the history of exploration, but it is not a significant factor in the story of the Gap or of the population history of ancient Canada. The reason it matters to mention it here is that the Norse story is sometimes used in popular media and in certain corners of the internet to suggest that European presence in Canada goes back much further than L'Anse aux Meadows, and that this earlier presence is being suppressed by mainstream archaeology. There are claims of runic inscriptions in the interior of the continent, of Norse settlements in the Great Lakes Basin, of contact events that somehow account for genetic or cultural discontinuities in the pre-contact record. None of these claims are supported by credible evidence. The runic inscriptions are, almost without exception, later forgeries or natural geological formations that have been misinterpreted. The proposed interior Norse sites do not hold up under examination. The gap in the Canadian archaeological record is thousands of years older than any possible Norse contact, and it does not require a European explanation. The gap is a Canadian story. It is the story of indigenous peoples, of ancient environments, of deep time. It predates any European presence by millennia, and its causes and consequences are rooted entirely in the dynamics of the land, the climate, and the people who were here long before anyone sailed from Europe. This matters not just for accuracy, but for understanding. The impulse to attribute the remarkable things about pre-contact North American history to outside influence, whether Norse or Phoenician or some other Old World source, is an impulse rooted in the same assumptions that made it difficult for 19th century scholars to believe that the earthworks of Cahokia or the mounds of Ohio could have been built by indigenous peoples. Those assumptions were wrong. The great cultures of pre-contact North America were built by the people who lived there, drawing on their own knowledge, their own creativity, their own deep relationships with their landscapes. The gap is one of the great mysteries of their history. It deserves to be understood on its own terms. One of the most striking things about pre-gap Canada is the evidence for long-distance exchange networks, and one of the most striking things about the gap itself is what happens to those networks when the populations that maintain them disappeared. The old copper complex is a tradition of metalworking centered on the Lake Superior Basin that represents one of the earliest and most extensive uses of native copper in the world. Beginning perhaps 8,000 years ago and continuing, with variations, into the post-gap period, peoples of the Great Lakes region were extracting native copper from deposits on the shores and in the waters of Lake Superior, working it into tools and ornaments through a combination of cold hammering and annealing, and distributing the finished products across a trade network that eventually stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the far north. The engineering sophistication of old copper objects is genuinely impressive. Socketed spear points, fish hooks with integral barbs, awls and punches and chisels and axes. These are not simple ornaments, but functional tools manufactured from a material that required considerable technical knowledge to work effectively. Native copper, unlike the smelted copper of the Old World, cannot be cast. It must be worked mechanically, through a process of repeated hammering and heating that work hardens the metal and then anneals it to allow further working. Mastering this process to the point of producing consistently shaped, structurally sound tools required both theoretical knowledge and practical skill that could only be developed and transmitted through generations of training. The distribution of old copper objects tells us something important about the social landscape of pre-gap Canada. Objects manufactured from Lake Superior copper appear at sites in Quebec, in Manitoba, in the Appalachian region of what is now the American South, and at sites in the plains that are hundreds of kilometers from any copper source. They appear in burial contexts, interred with individuals who were evidently of high status, since copper was clearly a prestige material, and in domestic contexts where copper tools were being used for everyday purposes. The range and density of old copper distribution suggest a trade network that was active, well organized, and sustained over thousands of years. And then, during the gap period, the distribution thins. Old copper objects become less common in the record, particularly at the more distant ends of the exchange network. The inference is that the disruption of populations during the gap disrupted the social networks that maintained the copper trade. When the communities along the trade routes fragmented or dispersed, the relationships that had allowed goods to move thousands of kilometers from their sources through a series of short-distance exchanges, each maintained by specific social bonds and obligations, broke down. The copper stayed closer to its source, the far-flung distribution that had characterized the peak of the old copper. Tradition contracted. After the gap, long-distance exchange recovers, but it looks different. The Hopewell tradition, which peaks in the period roughly 2,000 to 1,500 years ago, and which represents the most extensive pre-contact exchange network in North American history, north of Mesoamerica, is in some ways a successor to the old copper networks, incorporating copper along with obsidian and mica and marine shells and other prestige materials into a continental exchange system of remarkable geographic reach. But Hopewell is not simply the old copper tradition revived. It is something new, organized around different ceremonial and social structures, centered in different locations, and involving different communities. The gaps and recoveries in the long-distance exchange record of ancient North America are themselves a kind of documentary evidence for the gap. When trade networks collapse, it is because the people who maintain them have been disrupted. When they recover in new forms with new participants, it suggests that the recovery involved new populations or fundamentally reorganized old ones. The trade networks are like a circulatory system, and the gap is like a period of severe illness. The circulation slows, the extremities suffer, and when health returns, the circulation resumes, but the body that it serves is not quite the same body as before. The copper, in those museum cases, the beautiful spear points and the intricately shaped ornaments, green and mellow with age, is a kind of message from the pre-gap world. It was made by people who believed in the future, who made things intended to last, who built relationships across enormous distances because they understood that connection was how survival worked. The gap interrupted those connections, but it did not end them permanently. Something of what those people built persisted, changed and diminished, but alive, and eventually grew again into something new. There is a hypothesis about the gap that appears rarely in the published literature, but that surfaces with some regularity in the conversations that archaeologists and anthropologists have with each other when the recording devices are off. It is uncomfortable enough that most researchers prefer not to commit it to print without considerably more evidence than currently exists. But it deserves to be addressed, even in a speculative way, because if it is correct, it would change the interpretation of the gap substantially. The hypothesis is this, that the gap, or at least a significant component of it, was caused by a disease epidemic. Disease as a driver of pre-contact population decline in North America is not a new idea. The catastrophic population collapses that followed European contact in the Americas in the 16th and 17th centuries. The epidemics of smallpox, measles, typhus, and other Old World diseases that swept through indigenous populations with no prior exposure and therefore no immunity are among the most devastating demographic events in human history. Estimates for the population decline in the Americas between contact and the 17th century range from 50 to 90%, depending on the region and the diseases involved. These were not gradual declines. They were catastrophic drops, occurring within a generation or two of initial contact. The standard narrative is that these epidemics were possible only because of the introduction of old world diseases that had never circulated in the Americas. Without that introduction, without the smallpox and measles and influenza of Eurasia, the Americas were a disease-light environment where epidemic mortality on that scale was not possible. but this narrative is increasingly being questioned. There is evidence, fragmentary, contested, but not negligible, that serious epidemics occurred in pre-contact North America caused by diseases that were already present in the Americas rather than introduced from outside. Some paleopathological studies of pre-contact skeletal populations have identified evidence for what appear to be epidemic-scale mortality events. Cemeteries showing sudden increases in burial rates, skeletal populations showing signs of nutritional stress and immune suppression, patterns of population decline in the bioarchaeological record that look like the aftermath of a major infectious disease event. The evidence is not definitive. Skeletal evidence for specific diseases is often ambiguous, and the leap from individual pathological specimens to population-level conclusions requires caution. But the pattern is suggestive enough that a growing number of researchers are willing to include disease as at least a contributing factor in pre-contact population disruptions. For the gap specifically, several scenarios are plausible. A novel pathogen could have emerged or evolved in one part of the continent and spread through the existing trade networks, which, as we have seen, connected communities across enormous distances. Trade networks that carry goods also carry people, and people carry diseases. A sufficiently lethal pathogen moving through a network of communities that had no prior exposure could have produced rapid and widespread population decline, faster and more complete than any climate event. Alternatively, a zoonotic disease, one that normally circulated in animal populations and crossed into humans, could have jumped into the human population at a time when human communities were already stressed by climate change and resource depletion, pushing stressed populations past the threshold of recovery. Zoonotic spillovers are more likely when human communities are in close, sustained contact with animal populations, under stress, exactly the situation that would have prevailed during the Altithermal, when warming temperatures were disrupting animal population dynamics and pushing people and animals into new patterns of contact. We may never have definitive proof of a gap period epidemic. The biological evidence that would be needed, ancient pathogen DNA from skeletal remains, population-level mortality spikes in the bioarchaeological record, is difficult to recover from the archaeological context available to us, and the conditions of preservation in most Canadian archaeological sites are not conducive to the survival of ancient biological material. But the possibility is real enough that it needs to be included in any honest accounting of what might have caused the gap. Disease is not a comfortable explanation. It implies a level of human suffering during this period that the clean language of archaeological inference tends to obscure. But the history of ancient Canada was not a comfortable history, and doing justice to it requires acknowledging what the evidence might be telling us, even when what it might be telling us is painful. Across Canada, there are places where the relationship between human beings and the land goes so deep that it becomes something different from what most people mean when they use the word history. These are places where the rocks themselves carry human meaning, where the presence of human beings has been accumulating for so long that the distinction between the natural and the cultural begins to dissolve. The Majorville medicine wheel on the Bow River in Alberta is one such place. A large cairn of stone surrounded by a circle of boulders, with rock lines radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. It sits on a hilltop overlooking the river valley, visible for a considerable distance in every direction. When archaeologists first systematically studied it in the 1970s, the expectation was that it would prove to be a relatively recent construction, perhaps a few hundred years old, a monument of the historic plains cultures. The radiocarbon dates were a surprise. The central cairn of the Majorville medicine wheel has been continuously built up and added to for at least 5,000 years. It was already old during the gap period. It has been a sacred and maintained site for longer than the entire history of Egypt. What the Majorville medicine wheel represents, at one level, is a form of cultural continuity that transcends the gap. The gap may have disrupted populations and replaced cultures in other parts of Canada, but at Majorville, someone kept coming back. The cairn kept growing. The meaning of the place, whatever that meaning was, in the understanding of each successive generation of people who added stones to it, persisted through the disruption. Either the people who cared for the site survived the gap period with enough cultural continuity to maintain the tradition, or the site was sufficiently sacred and visible that new populations who moved into the area adopted and continued the practice of maintaining it. Either way, the continuity is remarkable. The writing on stone area in southern Alberta, Aisina-ipi in Blackfoot, meaning it is written or it has been marked, preserves petroglyphs and pictographs that span an extraordinary range of time, from images that are several thousand years old to images made in the 19th century. The rock art record at Aisina-ipi is a kind of visual history of the southern Alberta plains, and it shows a complex pattern of continuity and change that mirrors what the archaeological record tells us about the gap period. Some images are clearly very old, belonging to artistic traditions that do not survive into the later record. Others show stylistic continuity across long periods. Others are new creations, appearing in the record after apparent breaks. The rock art cannot be precisely dated in most cases. The techniques available for dating rock imagery are limited and contested, but the patterns it shows are consistent with the broader picture of pre-gap cultural richness, gap period disruption, and post-gap recovery that we see in the artifact and site distribution record. What the sacred sites tell us, most importantly, is that the land itself carries memory. The people who came after the gap, whoever they were, however they related to their predecessors, were coming to a land that was already full of meaning. The rock art was already there. The medicine wheel was already there. The burial sites, the sacred springs, the places where the animals came reliably and where the view of the sky was right for tracking the movements of the stars, all of these were already there, already marked and already known. Whether the new populations read those markings in the same way as their predecessors, whether they understood the full context of what they were inheriting, we cannot know. What we can say is that they found themselves in a landscape that had been shaped by human presence for thousands of years, that bore the traces of all the people who had come before them, and that offered to those willing to look and to listen a kind of instruction about how to live in this specific place. The gap did not erase that instruction. The land remembered, even when the people had gone, and the land was still there when they came back. In that sense, the gap was not an ending. It was an interval, a breath drawn between one chapter and the next. The story of human life in Canada did not begin again after the gap. It continued from a different starting point, drawing on a past that was never entirely lost, in a landscape that had never stopped being inhabited, if not by people, then by the traces of people pressed into the stone and the earth and the memory of the land itself. The story of the gap is not static. New discoveries are continuously changing the picture in ways that sometimes complicate the established narrative and sometimes unexpectedly clarify it. In 2017, a team of archaeologists working at a site called Tree Cay Island off the central coast of British Columbia announced dates for a set of hearths that placed human occupation of the site at 14,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest known archaeological sites in Canada and one of the oldest in the Americas. The significance of the Tree Cay Island site goes beyond the dates themselves. The site is on a small island that would have been accessible only by boat, suggesting that the people who occupied it were maritime adapted, capable of open water navigation, and were using the coastal route to move through the Americas long before the interior ice-free corridor was navigable. The Trique Island discovery, and others like it along the Pacific coast, is slowly building a case for a model of the initial peopling of the Americas that looks quite different from the classic Clovis first narrative. Rather than a single founding event via the interior, the evidence increasingly suggests a coastal founding event, people moving along the kelp highway of the North Pacific, exploiting the extraordinarily productive marine ecosystem of the Pacific coast, and spreading southward along the coast before expanding inland. This coastal first model has significant implications for the gap, because it means that the populations of the Pacific coast may have had much greater antiquity than the standard model allowed, and may therefore have experienced the gap as a disruption to a way of life that had been stable for a very long time. In 2020, ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains found at a site in British Columbia added another dimension to the picture. The genome of the individual, a young woman who died approximately 10,000 years ago, showed a genetic signature that was distinct from both modern Pacific Northwest populations and from the ancient Beringian populations that served as the founding stock of most Native Americans. She appears to represent a branch of the founding population that diverged early, adapted to Pacific coastal conditions, and then was eventually absorbed into or replaced by other populations. She is a ghost population, a genetic shadow of a lineage that once existed and then disappeared. Precisely the kind of thing we would expect to find if the gap period disruptions were as significant as they appear. In the Arctic, the ongoing work of recovering and sequencing ancient DNA from Dorset sites is beginning to fill in the picture of what happened to that culture. The emerging genetic data confirms what the oral traditions have suggested. The Dorset were not simply absorbed into the Thule population, they were replaced. Their genetic signature, distinct and traceable, essentially disappears from the Canadian record after the Thule expansion, with only trace amounts appearing in modern Inuit genomes. This is not the genetic signal of gradual assimilation. It is the signal of a population that was largely replaced, either through direct violence, competitive exclusion from resources, or disease. In eastern Canada, a recently completed survey of submerged archaeological sites off the coast of Nova Scotia has recovered artifacts from depths suggesting occupation of the drowned continental shelf at multiple periods over the last 8,000 years. The density of material recovered from certain underwater areas suggests that the drowned landscapes of the Atlantic coast were intensively occupied. More intensively, perhaps, than the currently above water areas where most archaeological survey work has been focused. The implication is significant. A substantial portion of the population of pre-gap eastern Canada may have been living in landscapes that are now underwater, and the disappearance of these populations from the terrestrial archaeological record during the gap may be partly explained by the loss of their primary habitats to rising seas. The technology for underwater archaeological survey is improving rapidly. Sonar mapping, remote sensing, submersible drones, and improved diving equipment are making it possible to study drowned landscapes at depths and in conditions that were inaccessible to previous generations of researchers. The next decade of underwater archaeology off the coasts of Canada may recover evidence that significantly changes our understanding of the gap, confirming or qualifying its extent, identifying the populations that experienced it, and potentially answering some of the questions about causes that have so far resisted resolution. The gap is not a closed question, it is an open one, and it is getting more open as better tools and better methods are brought to bear on it. Every new site excavated, every new genome sequenced, every new stretch of underwater terrain surveyed adds a piece to a puzzle that is large enough that even significant additions can be absorbed without completing the picture. But the picture is getting clearer. Slowly, incompletely, with many false turns and revised interpretations, the shape of what happened to the people of ancient Canada 5,000 years ago is coming into focus, and what it is showing us is a story of complexity and suffering and resilience that deserves to be told and heard with care. We have been moving through deep time tonight, through layers of stone and sediment and human memory, and it is worth pausing before we close to ask what all of this means. Not what it means in the abstract, not as a question for a thesis committee or a conference panel, but what it means in the way that history always means something when you let it in, as a mirror for understanding the world we actually live in. The gap in the Canadian archaeological record is, at its most fundamental, a story about what happens to human communities when their environments change faster than their adaptations can keep pace. The Altai thermal was not a catastrophe by geological standards. Compared to the rapid climate change of the late Quaternary, the advance and retreat of glacial ice, the extinction of megafauna, the dramatic reordering of the entire ecological architecture of the continent, the warming and drying of the mid-Holocene was a relatively modest event, and yet it was enough. The combination of temperature stress, aridity, resource depletion, rising seas, and possibly volcanic disruption was enough to fragment populations that had been stable for thousands of years, to disrupt trade networks that had connected the continent, to collapse cultures that had developed over millennia. The people who experienced the gap did not know it was a gap. They did not know, as the resources thinned and the communities dispersed, that there would be a recovery, that what they were building and maintaining and transmitting would eventually be rebuilt by their descendants or by the people who came after them. They knew only the immediate reality, that the land was changing, that the animals were moving, that the water was rising, that the things that had always worked were working less well, and that survival required moving, adapting, letting go of the places and the practices and the relationships that were no longer sustainable. This is not an abstract lesson. It is a very immediate one. The climate is changing again. The resources are shifting again. The landscapes that communities have known and organized their lives around for generations are being transformed, in some cases rapidly, enough that the change is visible within a single lifetime. The people experiencing these transformations in coastal communities, in Arctic communities, in communities that depend on specific ecological conditions for their food security and their cultural continuity, they are in a position that is not, in its essentials, so different from the people of ancient Canada who face the altithermal. The difference is that we know about the gap. We know that human communities have faced major environmental disruptions before, and we know that some of them survived. We know from the deep record of human resilience preserved in the archaeological evidence and the oral traditions and the sacred sites of this country that it is possible to come through a period of profound disruption with enough cultural continuity intact to rebuild, to create something new that honors what was lost without being paralyzed by the loss. That knowledge matters. It is not a guarantee of anything. The gap was also a period of genuine, irreversible loss, of people, of knowledge, of cultural traditions that did not survive, of relationships between communities and landscapes that were not reestablished, of futures that were not realized. Not everything survived. Not everything can be rebuilt. Some of what was lost in the gap is gone permanently, in the same way that the extinction of a species removes something from the world that cannot be restored. But something survived. The people who are here today, the First Nations and Métis and Inuit peoples of Canada, and through them and alongside them the millions of others who have made this country their home, are the proof that something survived. The traditions and languages and relationships to the land that are still alive, often against extraordinary odds, in Indigenous communities across Canada are the direct inheritance of that survival. They are what made it through the gap, carried by people who did not have the luxury of knowing whether what they were preserving would ever find its way to an audience capable of receiving it. It found its way. We are that audience, and the least we can do in return for that gift is listen carefully to what it is telling us. In the Yukon, near the border with Alaska, there is a series of caves in a limestone ridge overlooking the Bluefish River Valley that may contain the oldest evidence of human presence in the Americas. The Bluefish Caves were excavated by Jacques Cinq-Mars beginning in the late 1970s, and the material recovered from them included, among other things, horse and mammoth bones bearing cut marks, the unmistakable traces of a stone tool being used to remove meat from a carcass, that were dated to approximately 24,000 years ago. 24,000 years. That date, if valid, would place human beings in the Yukon during the height of the last glacial maximum, when most of North America was buried under ice, and the standard models for human migration into the Americas would say that no one was here yet. The implications are significant enough that the Bluefish Caves dates were, for years, treated with considerable skepticism by the North American archaeological community. Cinq-Mars spent the last 2 decades of his career defending the site's evidence against critics who argued that the cut marks might be natural, that the dating might be contaminated, that the results might be an artifact of excavation methodology. The debate has not been entirely resolved, but the tide has shifted considerably. A comprehensive reanalysis of the Bluefish Caves material published in 2017 confirmed that the cut marks on the bones were indeed consistent with human activity, specifically with the removal of meat from a carcass using a stone flaking tool, and confirmed the antiquity of the material. The horses and mammoths whose bones were marked by human tools were being processed in the Yukon approximately 24,000 years ago. Human beings were here earlier than anyone had wanted to believe. The Bluefish Caves matter for the story of the gap in a specific way. If human beings were present in the Yukon during the glacial maximum, then the founding population of the Americas was not a group of migrants who arrived in a single wave 15,000 years ago. It was a much older, more established population that had been living in the Americas for much longer. A population with 24,000 years of history in the land has developed much deeper ecological knowledge, much more stable cultural traditions, much more complex relationships with the landscape than a population that arrived 15,000 years ago. The disruption of such a population by the events of the gap would represent a much greater loss of knowledge, of cultural complexity, of accumulated ecological wisdom than the disruption of a more recently established population. This changes the emotional register of the gap if you think about it carefully. The people who experienced the gap were not newcomers to their landscapes. They were the descendants of people who had been living in those places for 20,000 years or more. Their knowledge of those landscapes was not just practical. Knowledge accumulated over a few generations. It was deep time knowledge, understanding earned through thousands of years of intimate, sustained engagement with specific environments, transmitted through generations of careful teaching and learning, refined and enriched by each successive generation's experience and experiment. Some of that knowledge survived the gap, preserved in oral traditions and in the embodied practices of the communities that made it through. But some of it did not. The communities that fragmented and dispersed, the trade networks that broke down, the ceremonial traditions that were interrupted, All of these carried knowledge that was not fully recoverable when the disruption ended. The post-gap world was rebuilt, as we have seen, with impressive skill and resilience. But it was rebuilt without everything that had been lost. The gap represents not just a population disruption, but an epistemological one, a loss of accumulated knowledge about the world that may never be fully recovered. The Bluefish Caves and the emerging picture of a much longer and more complex pre-gap history in Canada that they represent add weight to that loss. We are not talking about a gap in the history of recent arrivals finding their footing in a new land. We are talking about a gap in the history of a civilization old enough by the time the gap occurred to have been practicing the oldest forms of North American land management, ecological stewardship, and cultural transmission for thousands of years. Whatever was lost in the gap was the product of an extraordinary investment of human time and intelligence and care. It deserves to be mourned, even at this distance, even through the imperfect medium of archaeology and genetics and oral tradition. It was real and it mattered. There is something fitting about exploring this story in the hours given to sleep and rest. The gap, after all, is a kind of sleep in the historical record, a period of quiet, of reduced activity, of the world drawing inward and waiting. The evidence goes still, the hearths go cold, the middens stop growing, the tools stop accumulating in the sediment. And then, after a period of time that varies by region and context, but that spans centuries in most places and longer in some, the evidence resumes. The hearths restart. The middens begin to grow again. The tools appear. The world wakes up. Sleep is not death. The quietness of the gap is not the quietness of an ending. What we have been exploring tonight is a period of profound disruption and change, of population movement and cultural transformation, of loss and resilience and eventual recovery. It is not a story about disappearance finally, though it contains disappearances. It is a story about persistence, about the extraordinary capacity of human beings and human communities to survive disruption, to adapt to changed circumstances, to find ways of maintaining continuity even when the external conditions of their lives have been fundamentally altered. The people who moved during the gap carried things with them, not just physical things, tools, food stores, objects of trade and ceremony, but knowledge, stories, ways of relating to the land, understandings of seasonal patterns and animal behavior and plant medicine accumulated over generations and stored not in writing but in memory, in practice, in the bodies of people who had learned them as children and would teach them to their own children in turn. The loss during the gap was real, and some of what was lost did not survive. But the core of the transmission held. The stories kept being told. The knowledge kept being passed on. And when the conditions became survivable again, when the climate stabilized, when the seas stopped rising, when the volcanic winters ended, the people who emerged from the disruption still knew enough to rebuild. This is, in some sense, the most important thing the gap tells us. Not the details of its causes, not the specifics of which cultures disappeared and which survived, not the precise chronology of the disruption and the recovery. The most important thing is the demonstration that the transmission of human knowledge and human ways of being in the world is more robust than any particular set of conditions, that the story survives the disruption, that the thread, even when it comes close to breaking, does not break entirely. There have been other gaps. There will be others. Every civilization, every culture, every community that has ever existed has faced disruptions that threatened its continuity. Some of those communities recovered and rebuilt. Some did not. The difference between the ones that recovered and the ones that didn't is not fully understood. It may be partly luck, partly the severity of the disruption, partly the particular strengths and vulnerabilities of each specific community and culture. But there is evidence in the archaeological record of Canada and in the oral traditions of the peoples who have lived here that certain things matter. Archaeological knowledge matters. Social connections matter. The relationships between communities that allow knowledge and people and resources to move across large distances matter. The stories that hold communities together and give them a framework for understanding disruption and finding their way through it matter. The gap is a lesson if we are willing to learn from it. Not a comfortable lesson and not a simple one, but a real one learned by real people in a real landscape and preserved for us in the evidence they left behind, in the stone tools and the ochre paintings and the oral traditions and the ancient DNA and the middens on the seafloor and the medicine wheels on the hilltops. We are, all of us, the inheritors of people who survive something. The Gap may be the most dramatic example of that survival in the deep history of Canada, but it is not the only one. The people who are here today, all the people who are here today, are here because their ancestors, however far back, you trace the line, made it through. That is the common inheritance of everyone who draws breath on this earth tonight. Let that be the last thought before sleep, the long line of survival that runs from the deep past to the present moment, the people who made it through, the knowledge they carried, the stories they told, the marks they left on the stone. We are here because they were there, and that is, in the end, a remarkable thing. There's a place at the edge of a lake in the Canadian Shield, not far from where the last ice retreated, where the bedrock comes to the surface in broad, smooth shelves of Precambrian granite. The granite is old in a way that is difficult to hold in the mind, nearly 4 billion years old, formed in the deep time before the continents had taken their current shapes, before the first complex organisms had evolved, before almost anything that we recognize as the modern world had come into existence. On that granite, human beings made marks, ochre paintings pressed into the stone face with fingertips or with tools depicting figures that are now faded but still visible. Animals, human shapes, geometric forms whose meaning we can only guess at. These paintings were made at different times by different people over a span of thousands of years. Some of them may have been made before the Gap. Some of them certainly were made after it. The people who made them did not leave any other explanation of what they meant. The painting was the explanation. The mark on the stone was the word that said, "I was here." Someone was here. This place was seen and known and found worthy of a mark. The Gap does not appear in those paintings. The disruption does not show on the stone face. What shows is the continuous, unbroken desire of human beings to leave their mark on the world, to say to whoever comes after them that this place was inhabited by someone who found it beautiful or sacred or worth commemorating. The Gap is between the marks. The marks themselves say something different. They say, "We were always here. We are always here. Whatever happened in between, we kept coming back." And that is perhaps the most truthful thing that can be said about the Gap, when all the scientific language and the academic debate and the careful hedging of an uncertainty have been set aside. The people of ancient Canada kept coming back. They kept finding ways to survive in a landscape that was actively transforming around them. They kept making their marks on the stone and telling their stories around the fire and teaching their children what they needed to know to navigate a world that was sometimes generous and sometimes brutal, but always, always worth the effort of learning. The Gap is 5,000 years of mystery embedded in 12,000 years of documented human history in Canada. It is a question that may never be fully answered, but it is a question worth sitting with in the quiet hours when the world outside has gone still and the mind is open and the distance between now and then seems a little smaller than it does in the busy daylight. The people who experienced the gap were real. Their lives mattered in exactly the way your life matters. Their losses were real losses. Their resilience was real resilience, and their survival, improbable, incomplete, extraordinary, is the reason that there is a story to tell at all. Sleep well. Carry the question gently. The story continues in the morning, as it always has, as it always will.